It was an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in the small town of Millfield. The streets were quiet, the sun was shining through a cloudless sky, and the usual hum of the community filled the air. For Sarah Johnson, a bright 17-year-old high school student, it was just another day like any other. She had woken up early, spent the day studying, and was now heading to her favorite cafe after school. It was her escape, a quiet corner where she could relax with a cappuccino, read, or people watch. A place that felt like home. Sarah had always been the type of person who kept to herself. She was quiet, introspective, and a bit of an outsider in Millfield, a town known for its close-knit but often divisive community. As one of the few black students at her high school, Sarah had always felt like she didn't completely belong, but she didn't mind. She had her friends, a small but supportive circle of people who accepted her for who she was, and her family, which meant the world to her. Her father, James Johnson, was well known in Millfield. A successful businessman who had built his reputation over years of hard work and dedication, he had risen through the ranks of a major national company. His name carried weight in their community, and Sarah had always admired his ambition. Yet, despite his success, James was humble, always encouraging Sarah to pursue her own path, no matter how ordinary it might seem. Success isn't about recognition, he would say, it's about living your truth and being a good person. Sarah's mother, Lisa, was also a strong presence in their household. She had worked as a teacher for many years and was known for her caring nature. Together, her parents had instilled in her values of hard work, empathy, and integrity. They never made her feel like being different was something to hide, though they often warned her about the subtle racism that might exist in Millfield. As Sarah walked into her favorite cafe, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and the soft clink of mugs and quiet chatter from other patrons greeted her. She smiled, recognizing the friendly barista behind the counter, who always made her cappuccino just the way she liked it. Sarah was about to take a seat at a window booth when she noticed an older woman sitting alone at a nearby table, staring intently at her. The woman was familiar, Mary Thompson, a longtime resident of Millfield who was known for her outspoken views and conservative stance on almost everything. Mary wasn't someone Sarah interacted with often, but she had seen her around town, usually at town meetings or local gatherings, where Mary would argue her point with an air of superiority. Today, though, something felt off. Sarah could feel the woman's gaze, sharp and assessing, as she sipped her drink. "Sarah," Mary called, her voice a bit too loud for the intimate setting of the cafe. "You should know that people like you don't belong here." Sarah froze, the words hanging in the air like a cold slap to her face. She had heard whispers in the town before. People often made disparaging remarks about her race or subtly hinted that she didn't belong, but never so bluntly. She turned slowly to face the woman, who sat smugly, a look of superiority on her face. "I'm sorry," Sarah replied, her voice shaking slightly. She wasn't sure if she had heard her correctly. Maybe she had misunderstood. "I said," Mary repeated with a sneer, "people like you shouldn't be here. This is a decent place for decent people, not whatever you are." A few heads turned in the cafe, and Sarah's stomach dropped. Her cheeks burned, and her hands clenched into fists. She felt the anger bubbling up inside her, the familiar knot of frustration and helplessness that she had tried to ignore for years. She had faced racism before, but this was different. This was blatant, in public, and it wasn't just a comment, it was an attack. Her heart raced as she tried to remain calm, but the words stung, cutting deeper than she could have anticipated. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice trembling now. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Mary stood up slowly, towering over Sarah as she leaned forward. "You don't belong here, and neither do the rest of you people. This isn't your town, and you're making it worse." Sarah could feel the eyes of the cafe on her, the silence weighing heavily in the room. The people at the nearby tables exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to react. Some seemed to silently agree with Mary, while others appeared horrified by her words, but no one spoke up. Sarah's heart raced as she tried to process what was happening. Her mother had warned her about people like Mary, people who were too comfortable with their biases to see the harm they caused. But this? This felt different. It wasn't just a microaggression, it was an overt attack. The barista, a young woman Sarah had gotten to know over the past few months, looked at the situation nervously, but said nothing. The silence in the cafe was deafening, and Sarah felt every inch of it. She stood up, her hands shaking, but she wasn't about to let this woman get away with it. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, her voice growing firmer. "But this cafe is open to everyone. And if you don't like that, maybe it's you who doesn't belong here." Mary's face contorted in rage as she took a step toward Sarah. "You think you're going to get away with this? You think you can just talk to me like that?" Before Sarah could react, Mary reached out and slapped her across the face, hard. The sound of the slap echoed through the cafe, and the room fell silent. The sting on Sarah's cheek was sharp, but it was the shock and humiliation that hit the hardest. Tears welled in her eyes as she turned toward the door, struggling to regain her composure. She couldn't believe it. She had just been slapped in public for no reason other than her skin color. Mary stood there, smirking, as if she had just won some kind of victory. "Get out," she said coldly. "Now." Sarah felt her throat tighten, the sting of her cheek matched only by the bitter taste of defeat rising in her chest. She turned and walked toward the door, every step feeling heavier than the last. When she stepped outside into the cool air, the tears finally came, but not in the way she expected. She wasn't crying for herself, not yet. She was crying for what this moment meant, for what it exposed. It was a reminder that no matter how far she'd come, no matter how much she had achieved, there were people who would always see her as less than. The street outside was quiet, the sun still shining, but everything felt different now. The world seemed to slow down around her. The pain was still fresh, but it wasn't just about the slap. It was about the realization that there were people in the world who would never see her as an equal. And worse, there were people who would see her as a threat simply because of who she was. As Sarah walked home that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed forever. She had always known that racism existed in small pockets of the world, but never had she felt it so blatantly, so violently, in the place she called home. The town of Millfield, which had always felt like a safe place, now felt different. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, she wasn't going to let this go. Something had to be done, and if she had to be the one to stand up, she would. By the time Sarah got home, her hands were still shaking, and her mind was racing. What happened in that cafe wasn't just a personal attack, it was a reflection of something much larger. A reality she had never fully understood until now. As she walked into her house, her mother looked up from the kitchen, smiling. But when she saw Sarah's face, that smile faded. "Sarah, what happened?" her mother asked, concern flooding her voice. "I need to talk to Dad," Sarah said softly, her voice still shaking. "It's time we talked about the things we've been ignoring." And in that moment, Sarah knew that this incident would mark the beginning of something much bigger. The moment had come where her world, and the world of Millfield, would change forever. The events at the cafe had left Sarah feeling more exposed than ever. The slap, the words, the way Mary had looked at her like she was an intruder in her own town, it was all too much to process. She had always known that racism existed, but the intensity of the attack, the way it had been delivered so openly, felt like a slap in the face to everything her parents had taught her. It was a reminder that no matter how hard she worked or how much she succeeded, she could still be reduced to a stereotype in the eyes of others. When Sarah stepped through the door that evening, her mother, Lisa, instantly sensed something was wrong. Sarah's shoulders were hunched, her face pale, and her eyes were red from holding back tears. "Sweetheart, what happened?" "You're home early," Lisa asked, setting down the dish towel she had been wiping her hands with. Her voice was filled with concern, but there was an underlying strength in it, a resilience that had always been a part of Sarah's mother. Lisa had lived through her own share of struggles and had taught Sarah the importance of standing tall in the face of adversity. But tonight, there was something different in the air. This wasn't a lesson, this was a battle. "I don't even know where to begin, Mom," Sarah murmured, collapsing onto the couch. She buried her face in her hands, the weight of the day crashing down on her. Lisa sat down next to her, pulling her into a comforting embrace. She didn't push her daughter to talk. Instead, she just held her, allowing Sarah to collect herself in her own time. After a few moments of silence, Sarah finally spoke. "I was at the cafe, just minding my own business, and then this woman, Mary Thompson, she started talking to me. She said I didn't belong there. That people like me shouldn't be in this town. She said it's for decent people, whatever that means. And when I tried to stand up for myself, she slapped me, Mom. She slapped me right across the face in front of everyone. And then she told me to leave." Lisa's face tightened, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "That woman had no right to treat you like that, Sarah. No one has the right to do that to anyone. I'm so sorry you had to experience that." Her voice quivered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "But this isn't just about Mary, is it?" "No," Sarah admitted, wiping her eyes. "It's not just about her. It's about everything I've been ignoring. All those little comments and looks over the years. It's like they've been building up, and now it's all come to a head." Lisa sat back, her expression thoughtful. She had always known that Sarah faced challenges growing up in Millfield, but she had also hoped that things were changing, that people were becoming more accepting. She knew, however, that the road to true equality was a long one, and that Sarah would face moments like these throughout her life. But this time, it was different. Mary's attack wasn't just a random incident, it was a direct challenge to the very core of who Sarah was. And it made Lisa realize something: Sarah wasn't the only one who had been ignoring the truth. She had, too. "Sarah," Lisa said softly, her voice steady. "There's something I've never told you. Something your father and I have kept from you. I don't know if it will make things better or worse, but I think it's time you knew." Sarah looked up, confused. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Lisa hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the kitchen, as if the answer lay in the distance. "Your father is not just James Johnson. He's not just the businessman and community leader you know. He has connections that go way beyond what we've told you." Sarah furrowed her brow. "What do you mean?" "Dad's always been honest with me." Lisa sighed deeply. "Sarah, your father is more than just a successful man. He has ties to a network of powerful people, people who could change things in this town if they chose to. Your father is involved with some very influential figures. The kind of people who could make a difference, but he's never spoken about it. He wanted you to have a normal life, free from all that. But now, I think it's time you understood why your father acts the way he does." Sarah felt the words hit her like a freight train. "What do you mean? Dad is involved with what?" Lisa paused, as if weighing her words carefully. "Sarah, your father is a well-respected member of a very secretive organization. It's not something he ever wanted you to know about, but it's something that has influenced everything in our lives. He has been working with people in law enforcement, in government, and beyond, people who are committed to fighting against the kind of hate you've experienced today. He's worked with these people for years, and they've been quietly watching out for us, protecting us in ways you'll never fully understand." Sarah was stunned. "You're telling me Dad knows people who could have stopped this from happening to me today? Why hasn't he done anything? I think your father didn't want to involve you in that world. He's always tried to protect you from it," Lisa said, her eyes clouded with concern. But now that things have escalated, I think he's realizing that silence won't protect us anymore. He's been living in the shadow of this for years, trying to keep you safe. But today, you saw the truth, Sarah. The world isn't always as safe as we like to believe, and sometimes, the people who seem the most powerful are the ones who are too afraid to use their influence when it matters. As the weight of her mother's words settled on her, Sarah felt a mixture of disbelief and anger. How could her father, the man she had always admired, keep something like this from her? She had grown up hearing about his successes, his community involvement, but never once had she suspected that there was more to his life than met the eye. The realization that her father was tied to a network of powerful people, people who could have made a difference in moments like this, left her feeling conflicted. It wasn't just about the slap anymore, it was about the systemic issues that had allowed people like Mary to exist, to act with impunity, without fear of consequence. So, what does this mean? Sarah asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of confusion and resolve. What are we supposed to do now? Lisa looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with both pride and uncertainty. I think it's time you had a conversation with your father. He's been living in the shadows for so long, but he can't keep hiding anymore. If we want things to change, if we want to make a real difference, we need to start standing up, not just for ourselves, but for everyone in this town who's been silenced. Sarah nodded slowly, a surge of determination filling her chest. She wasn't sure what the future would hold or how her father's connections could change anything. But one thing was clear, she wasn't going to let Mary's slap be the end of this story. It was only the beginning. As Sarah headed up to her room that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything in her life was about to change. The world outside was bigger than she had ever imagined, and the power to change it lay not in the hands of people like Mary Thompson, but in the people who had been quietly working for justice all along, people like her father. But the question remained, would they act? Would they stand up when it mattered most? And for Sarah, that question now held more weight than ever. The time for silence was over. The world needed to hear their voices. The days following the cafe incident felt like they were dragging on. Sarah couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind. Mary Thompson's words and actions had shaken her to the core, but even more unsettling was the revelation about her father. She had always viewed him as a figure of strength, the quiet pillar of their family who had always been there for her. The idea that he was involved in something larger, something so secretive, made her question everything she had known. What had he been protecting her from? And why had he kept these secrets for so long? Sarah was determined to get answers. She couldn't go on pretending that everything was fine, that the world around her was as safe and just as her parents had led her to believe. As she sat in her room, staring out the window, her mind was made up, she had to talk to her father. That evening, after dinner, Sarah waited for the right moment. Her mother had gone out to meet a friend, leaving her alone with her father. He was sitting in the living room, reading the newspaper, his face expressionless as always. Sarah took a deep breath before walking toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Dad, can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James looked up from his newspaper, his expression softening when he saw the look on his daughter's face. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Sarah took a seat across from him, her hands nervously folding in her lap. She didn't know where to start, but she couldn't hold back any longer. "I found out something today. About you. About what you've been involved in." James's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't say anything. He simply set the newspaper down and looked at her, waiting for her to continue. "Mom told me about the people you know. The connections you have. The secretive organization you've been working with. Why didn't you ever tell me about any of this?" James sighed, his gaze shifting toward the window as if searching for the right words. "Sarah, I never wanted you to be involved in any of this. You've always been my priority, and I wanted to shield you from the dangers that come with it." "Danger? What danger?" Sarah's voice trembled with frustration. You kept this from me for my whole life, Dad. I found out about all of this today, and it's like a part of me has been lied to. I don't understand why you didn't trust me with the truth. How many times did you let people like Mary Thompson walk all over us, just because you didn't want to get involved? James's expression hardened at the mention of Mary's name. He stood up from his chair and walked over to the window, his back turned to Sarah. It's not that simple, Sarah. The people I've worked with, they're not like the people you think. They're not interested in fighting petty battles with people like Mary. They're focused on bigger things. Things that can change the world. But they can't do it openly. They can't let the public know what they're doing. It's a delicate balance. A delicate balance? Sarah echoed, her voice rising with anger. You're telling me you've been sitting back, waiting for the right time, while people like Mary attack us? While people like me get treated like garbage? I'm supposed to just sit here and be quiet because it's all part of some bigger plan that I don't even understand? James turned around slowly, his face a mixture of regret and frustration. It's not like that. You have to understand, this isn't about individual battles. It's about the bigger picture. There's so much more at stake here than you realize. I didn't want to drag you into this world, but now, maybe it's time you saw what I've been protecting you from. Sarah was taken aback by his words. What do you mean by that? What have you been protecting me from? James took a deep breath, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. I've been protecting you from the dangers that come with trying to change a system that has been in place for generations. The people I work with, they're not just fighting racism on a local level. They're fighting something much bigger, systemic inequality, corruption, and injustice at the highest levels. People like Mary Thompson, people who perpetuate hate, they're just the tip of the iceberg. But going after them, taking action against people like her, could set off a chain reaction that would have dangerous consequences. I've kept you in the dark because I wanted you to be safe. But I see now that I've failed you. Sarah's mind was spinning. Her father, the man she had trusted above all others, was involved in something so much bigger than she had ever imagined. He had spent his life working behind the scenes, trying to make a difference in ways that most people would never understand. But at what cost? Was the safety of their family worth the silence and secrecy? Was it right to stand by and let things unfold without taking action, just because it was easier to do nothing? I don't know if I can accept that, Dad, Sarah said quietly, her voice shaking. I don't know if I can just sit back and pretend like everything is okay. What happened today, with Mary? What happens the next time someone like her attacks me? Am I supposed to stay quiet then, too? James walked over to her, kneeling down so that he was eye level with his daughter. Sarah, I never wanted you to feel like you had to stay quiet. But I've seen the bigger picture, the consequences of exposing everything. The people I work with, they're careful, and they do things in their own way. I don't expect you to understand everything right now, but I need you to trust me. Trust that everything I've done has been to keep you safe, to protect this family. But what about Mary? Sarah asked, her voice tinged with defiance. What about people like her who think they can get away with treating us like we don't belong? Am I supposed to just turn the other cheek, like you've done all these years? James looked at his daughter, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. You don't have to turn the other cheek, Sarah. But you have to understand that the fight is bigger than one person. I've been trying to play the long game, to make the right moves at the right time. And I think now is the time for you to join me in that fight. But it's not going to be easy. We're up against a system that's been in place for decades. Sarah's heart raced as she processed his words. Her father was asking her to join him, to be a part of something much bigger than herself. But was she ready for it? Was she ready to confront the forces that had been allowed to fester in their town, in their community, for so long? Or would she continue to live in the safety of her own ignorance, shielded from the harsh realities of the world around her? "I don't know if I'm ready, Dad," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't just sit by anymore. I have to do something." James smiled, a bittersweet smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I never wanted you to be ready, Sarah. I wanted you to have a chance at a normal life, a life where you didn't have to worry about people like Mary. But I see now that you're ready for this. You're ready to fight." As father and daughter stood in that quiet living room, Sarah realized that everything had changed. The life she had known was over. The fight for justice, for equality, was just beginning. And she was no longer willing to sit in the shadows, waiting for change to come. It was time to make it happen. In the days that followed her conversation with her father, Sarah felt the weight of everything settling on her shoulders. The world around her had changed, and the illusion of safety she had once felt was shattered. Her father's revelations had opened her eyes to a side of life she had never known, one filled with secrecy, power struggles, and a system designed to protect the privileged at all costs. She couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath her feet was unstable, that nothing was as it seemed. But there was no going back now. The conversation with her father had left her with a burning sense of responsibility, an urge to act, to do something, anything, to break the silence that had kept their family and the community in the dark for so long. The fight she had been naive to all her life was much bigger than Mary Thompson and the personal insults she had endured. It was a battle that stretched back generations, rooted in a complex web of politics, power, and money. Mary Thompson was just a pawn in a much larger game, and Sarah knew that she couldn't stop until she had uncovered the truth and exposed the forces at play. She tried to keep herself busy with school, but the constant distractions of the world outside crept into her thoughts, making it impossible to focus. Every conversation with her friends, every casual interaction with her peers, now seemed superficial, a veil that covered up the deeper problems that needed to be addressed. And yet, she felt isolated. No one else seemed to understand the gravity of what she was experiencing. Her friends were focused on trivial things, upcoming exams, weekend plans, the usual teenage gossip. Sarah could hardly remember a time when she wasn't preoccupied with bigger questions about justice and morality. It wasn't until one evening, as she was sitting in her room and scrolling through social media, that she stumbled upon a piece of information that could change everything. Her mind raced as she read an article about the very organization her father had been working with, a group that had been at the center of several high-profile cases of political corruption and whistleblowing in the past few years. The more Sarah dug into the details, the more she realized that the group was far more influential than her father had let on. They had connections that reached into the highest echelons of government, law enforcement, and business. And they weren't just fighting for racial equality, they were challenging the entire structure of power in the country. The article mentioned several key figures who had been involved in exposing government corruption, but it also hinted at something darker. The group was rumored to have a list of people they had targeted for re-education, individuals whose behavior was deemed to be in violation of the group's ideals. The idea of re-education sent a chill down Sarah's spine. What did that even mean? Was her father part of that effort? Was he involved in something far more radical than she had imagined? She couldn't ignore the questions swirling in her mind any longer. She had to confront her father again, to dig deeper into the secrets he had kept from her. She needed to understand what he was really a part of, and whether she was willing to accept the truth, no matter how ugly or dangerous it might be. That night, after dinner, she found her father in the study, working on a series of documents. He looked up when she entered, his expression weary but kind. "What's on your mind, Sarah?" he asked, sensing the unease in her posture. "I need to know more, Dad," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I need to understand what you're involved in. What exactly is this group you've been working with? What are they really about?" Her father's face hardened, and for a moment, Sarah saw something in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before: fear. It was subtle, fleeting, but it was there. He stood up slowly, folding his arms across his chest as if to protect himself from her probing questions. "Sarah, I've told you everything you need to know," he said, his tone defensive. "This is bigger than you can understand. You're not ready for this." "But I already know," Sarah pressed. "I know about the group, about the people you've been working with, about the kind of work they do. I need to understand why you're doing this, why you're involved in something that could change everything. You can't keep hiding things from me." Her father's face softened as he sighed deeply. He moved to the window, staring out into the night, as if searching for the right words. "You're right," he said, his voice quieter now. "I should have told you sooner. But I was trying to protect you, Sarah. You don't understand what it means to fight for change in this country. People like us, people who challenge the system, are labeled as enemies. And once you're labeled, there's no going back." Sarah's mind raced as she processed his words. The deeper she got into this, the more she realized how much danger her father was in, and how much danger she was now in as well. But that didn't stop her from pushing forward. "So what happens now? Are you going to keep working with them? Are we supposed to just sit back while they make all the decisions for us?" James turned around, his eyes meeting his daughter's with a mixture of sadness and protecting her from the outside world. He was protecting her from the very people who could destroy everything they stood for. But the more she learned, the more she saw how fragile their world really was. There was no guarantee of safety, no certainty that they would win this battle. It was a dangerous game, and now she was a part of it. Over the next few days, Sarah became more and more entangled in her father's world. She began to learn about the group's operations, its goals, and the risks involved in challenging a system so deeply entrenched in power. The more she understood, the more conflicted she became. The group's ideals aligned with her own. She had always wanted to see a world where equality wasn't just a dream, but a reality. But the methods they used, the secrecy, the manipulation, was that the price of change? Was it worth sacrificing everything for a cause that seemed to be built on deception? One evening, as Sarah was going over some of her father's files, she came across a list of names. It was a roster of individuals who had been targeted by the group, people whose behavior was deemed unacceptable. As she scanned the names, one stood out: Mary Thompson. The same woman who had caused so much trouble for her at the cafe. Her father had kept a file on Mary. It was then that the gravity of the situation hit Sarah with full force. Her father's actions had consequences, not just for their family, but for everyone involved. And now, the fight had become personal. It wasn't just about fighting for justice anymore. It was about protecting the ones they loved, and stopping people like Mary from spreading hatred and fear. But the deeper Sarah got into the fight, the more dangerous it became. Every choice she made seemed to pull her further into a web of deceit, corruption, and violence. As the stakes grew higher, she couldn't help but wonder, would the fight for justice be worth the cost of everything she had ever known? And in the end, what would be left to salvage? The days after Sarah's discovery seemed like a blur. The weight of everything she had learned crushed down on her, leaving her restless, anxious, and unable to think of anything but the battles ahead. She hadn't fully understood the risks before, but now the consequences of their actions seemed more real than ever. Each time she walked through the front door of her house, her father's secrets felt like they were closing in on her, like the walls were slowly coming down. The air was thick with unspoken words, and every glance seemed laden with meaning. But what terrified Sarah the most was the realization that there was no turning back now. Her father's world had always seemed so distant from her own. Growing up, Sarah had admired him, looked up to him as a man of principles and strength. But now she saw him through a different lens. The man she had always trusted, the man who had kept her safe from the world's ugliness, was knee-deep in a fight that was far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. And she was now a part of it, whether she liked it or not. Sarah had always believed that standing up for what was right meant simply speaking out. But this fight wasn't that simple. It wasn't just words anymore. It was a fight for survival, a battle against an unyielding, powerful system that would do anything to maintain control. The deeper she went into this world, the more she saw how fragile everything was. There were no guarantees, no promises of safety or success. All she could do was move forward, one step at a time, and hope that her actions would lead to something better. But as Sarah began to understand the true scope of her father's work, the more she realized how dangerous their involvement with the group had become. They weren't just targeting individuals like Mary Thompson, they were challenging a system that had been in place for centuries. The group's influence stretched into every corner of society, and the people they were up against were willing to fight dirty to protect their power. It was no longer just about racial equality or justice, it was about control. And Sarah was beginning to realize just how far people would go to keep that control. Her father had been right about one thing: there was no going back. Once you became a part of this fight, you were in it for life. Sarah had thought she could handle the truth, that she could take on whatever came her way. But the more she learned, the more she realized how ill-prepared she was for the world of political intrigue, manipulation, and violence that lay before her. She had been naive, thinking she could change things by simply standing up for what was right. The world didn't work that way. It wasn't long before Sarah's life took another unexpected turn. One afternoon, as she was walking home from school, she received a call from her father. His voice, usually steady and calm, was filled with a sense of urgency she hadn't heard before. "Sarah," he said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. There's been a change in plans. We need to meet as soon as possible. There's a situation we need to address." Her heart began to race. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew it couldn't be good. She had seen her father handle crises before, but this felt different. There was a tension in the air, a sense that everything was unraveling. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll explain when I see you. Just make sure you're safe, and don't tell anyone where you're going. Do you understand?" "Yeah, I understand." As Sarah hung up the phone, she felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. What could possibly be happening now? She had already witnessed so much, learned so much, but the thought of her father being caught in something even darker than before filled her with dread. She couldn't help but think of Mary Thompson and the way things had escalated so quickly. Was this another part of the same game, a bigger plot that was about to unfold? The air seemed to thicken as Sarah made her way to the meeting spot, a secluded park on the outskirts of town. She had never been there before, and the eerie silence of the place only heightened her sense of unease. The trees cast long shadows in the fading light of the evening, and the ground was littered with dry leaves that rustled in the breeze. It was the kind of place that felt abandoned, untouched by the outside world. A perfect setting for a clandestine meeting. When Sarah arrived, her father was already waiting. He stood with his back to her, his figure silhouetted against the setting sun. As she approached, he turned around, his face etched with worry. "Sarah," he said, his voice low. "There's no easy way to say this, but you need to know what's happening. We're in danger." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. "I've been working on something much bigger than I told you," he continued. "The group, the people I'm involved with, they've been pushing for something that's about to change everything. And there are people who will stop at nothing to make sure that doesn't happen." Before Sarah could respond, her father's phone rang. He answered it quickly, his eyes darting around nervously. "Yes," he said into the phone, his voice tense. He listened for a moment, his expression darkening as he heard the news. "I understand," he said finally, hanging up. "It's worse than I thought." "What's going on?" Sarah asked, now truly scared. The people we're fighting have made their move, her father replied. They've been watching us, and they've finally decided to strike. We have to go. Now. With no explanation, he grabbed her arm and led her toward the car, urging her to move quickly. They drove in silence, the weight of his words hanging over them like a dark cloud. As they neared their destination, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Her father's calm exterior hid a deep anxiety that only fueled her own fears. She could see the toll that this battle had taken on him, on both of them. They arrived at a rundown building on the edge of town. It looked abandoned, but Sarah could sense the activity inside. Her father's eyes were sharp as he surveyed the area, his instincts on high alert. He motioned for Sarah to stay close, his hand gripping hers tightly as they approached the entrance. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's where everything changes," her father replied, his tone grim. They entered the building cautiously, the air inside thick with the scent of dust and mildew. The faint sounds of muffled voices echoed through the halls, growing louder as they moved deeper into the structure. Sarah could feel her pulse quickening with every step, her nerves on edge. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew it was about to get worse. They reached a small room at the back of the building, where several people were gathered around a table. The moment Sarah saw them, she understood. These were the people her father had been working with, the group he had sworn her to keep in the dark about. They were all there, but something was off. The tension in the room was palpable, and Sarah could sense that the situation had gone from bad to worse. Her father stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the group. "We've been compromised," he said, his words sharp and calculated. "We need to move, and we need to move fast." As the group began to discuss their next steps, Sarah found herself standing on the edge of the room, overwhelmed by the weight of what she was witnessing. The choices being made were beyond her understanding, and with her father's, was now hanging by a thread. The fight for justice had begun, and there was no turning back. The reality of her father's involvement hit her harder than ever before. She had known this was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for the chaos that was now unfolding. They had reached the point of no return, and Sarah was about to face the full brunt of the war she had unknowingly entered. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined, and her life, along. The weight of the situation had never been clearer for Sarah than in those final moments. As she stood there, looking at her father and the people surrounding them, she couldn't help but feel like a pawn in a game much larger than herself. Everything she had known up until this point, the quiet life, the safe world she had tried to cling to, was crumbling around her. There was no escaping what had begun, no way to rewind and undo the decisions that had led them to this point. The group had been exposed, and everything they had worked for was now in jeopardy. But the real question was whether they would be able to fight back and survive. The room had an air of finality. The group was scattered, each person seeming to be deep in their own thoughts. Some were angry, others anxious, but all shared the same realization: the enemy was moving in. Their network was compromised, their plans in jeopardy, and the people who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes were now making their move. Sarah's father, always the calm one, seemed to have aged years in the past few days. His face was drawn, his shoulders sagged with the burden of what was happening, yet his resolve was unwavering. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about ensuring that their message, their fight, didn't die with them. For Sarah, it was as if the universe had suddenly tilted on its axis. She had been living in a world of illusions, thinking that her father's life was just an ordinary one, until she found out how wrong she was. The truth had shattered that illusion. But now, faced with the reality of what had been set in motion, she had to ask herself, could she stand by him? Could she face the consequences of this fight knowing how dangerous it could get? Her mind raced as she processed the conversations happening around her. There was talk of escape routes, safe houses, and last-ditch efforts to send messages to allies. Sarah had no idea who these allies were, but she knew it didn't matter. It was all about survival now. The group was working against the clock, each second passing like a ticking bomb ready to explode. They had no time to waste. The enemies they faced were ruthless, and the stakes were higher than ever. Her father turned to her suddenly, his face serious. "Sarah, I need you to listen. The next few hours will determine everything. If things go south, I need you to take your mother and get out of here. Don't wait for me. Don't try to fight. Just leave." His words hit her like a cold wave, sending a shiver down her spine. It was a part of her father she hadn't seen before, the man who was ready to make the ultimate sacrifice for what he believed in. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was willing to give up everything. Sarah wasn't sure if she could go along with his plan. She wasn't sure she could walk away from him, from everything they had built together, just because it had become too dangerous. "Dad," she started, her voice breaking. "I'm not leaving you." He gave her a hard look, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of anger and fear. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about us anymore. This is bigger than us. You have to survive, Sarah. You have to make sure the truth doesn't die with us." Sarah shook her head, feeling like a drowning woman in a sea of emotions. She wanted to fight, wanted to stand beside her father, but the reality of the situation was sinking in. There was no easy way out. The risks were astronomical. Her life, her family's safety, everything was now on the line. And the enemy they were up against didn't care about anything but maintaining their control, wiping out anyone who dared to stand in their way. She could hear the whispers of the others around her, the tension mounting with every passing second. They were preparing to move. It was now or never. The group had their eyes set on one last desperate move, a plan that could either destroy the enemy's network or lead to their complete downfall. The thought of it made Sarah's stomach churn. It was reckless, dangerous, and uncertain. But it was the only option left. As they made their way through the building, Sarah's heart raced in her chest. Every noise seemed amplified, every shadow seemed like a threat. She was acutely aware of the danger surrounding them. It wasn't just about them anymore, it was about every single person who had been affected by this fight. It was about Mary Thompson, about the people who had trusted them, about the truth they had tried so hard to protect. They reached the back exit of the building, the tension thick in the air. Sarah's father led the way, his steps swift but measured. Every decision they made was crucial now, every move a potential mistake. As they moved through the dark alleyway behind the building, the sound of footsteps echoing in the silence, Sarah realized just how much had changed in such a short time. Her whole life had been turned upside down, and she didn't know what would come next. But she knew one thing, this was only the beginning. They stopped in the middle of the alley, their backs to the wall, watching the shadows for any signs of movement. The plan was simple, they would split up, take different routes to confuse their enemies, and meet up at the safe house. But in the back of her mind, Sarah knew it wasn't going to be that easy. There was no such thing as an easy escape when you were up against an enemy this powerful. Her father's voice broke through her thoughts. "This is it. Stay safe, and stay together. Don't trust anyone but the people you know. And remember, if anything happens, you get to that safe house, no matter what." Sarah nodded, though the words felt hollow. She wanted to believe in the plan, wanted to believe that they could make it out of this alive. But the truth was, she didn't know if they would. The odds were stacked against them. And there was no guarantee that they would win. But the fight had to continue. There was no other choice. As they turned to leave, Sarah felt a strange calm wash over her. It wasn't peace, it wasn't relief. It was something more primal. A sense of purpose, of determination. She had been living in the shadows for too long, unsure of where she fit into her father's world. But now, as she faced the reality of the war they were fighting, she understood. This was bigger than her, bigger than any individual. It was a fight for everything they believed in, and no matter the outcome, she had to see it through. The alley was empty as they disappeared into the night. Sarah didn't know what the future held, but she knew that one way or another, this story was far from over. The world was changing, and they were at the center of it all. And as she took her first step into the unknown, she understood that everything would be different from here on out. She had chosen her side, and now there was no turning back.